The war in Ukraine raises lots of questions and observations that can be looked at from the perspective of various international relations theories. Let us start with the realist tradition. Realism assumes that the international state system is anarchical and inherently competitive and conflictual. In such an insecure world, states need to maximize their security by building up arms, forming alliances, and defend their positions on the global chessboard. Realism has a lot to say about the run-up to the Russian invasion and its aftermath. A good starter is the controversial thesis of the American scholar John Mearsheimer that the West is mostly to blame for the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which already started in 2014 and escalated in February 2022 with Russia's full-fledged invasion. As a so-called offensive realist, Mearsheimer holds that states maximize their power in terms of military capabilities and other assets to guarantee their security. At the same time, he is also a structural realist and assumes that great powers almost automatically respond to certain stimuli from their external environment in certain ways. This way of thinking provides for an even gloomier picture of international politics, in which great power conflict is always around the corner. Concretely, Mearsheimer contends that the West, the US and the rest of NATO, has provoked, cornered and humiliated Russia in multiple ways. For Russia, one of the big issues is how the West has tried to anchor Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence and Western institutions such as the EU and NATO. In 2008, at its summit in Bucharest, NATO declared that Ukraine will become a member state, even though there was no concrete time schedule for this, and it was known that major member states such as Germany and France kept opposing the idea. According to Mearsheimer, Russia perceives Ukrainian NATO membership as an existential threat, and therefore a red line. We could not expect anything else, because great powers simply do not want to lose relative power, let alone by losing the most strategic part of their sphere of influence. The Kremlin also asserts that the West was behind the 2014 Euromaidan revolution, which ousted the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. Russia reacted to this by supporting armed separatists and their self-declared republics Donetsk and Lugansk in the east of Ukraine, and by the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. The February 2022 invasion, then, was the predictable response to the ongoing efforts to lock Ukraine into the West, including through military cooperation. Realists predict that great powers will react harshly when a red line is crossed, and that the other actors are supposed to know that, whether they like it or not. This is a matter of causation and a way of establishing responsibility for the recent escalation in a scientific way. Hence, the US and Western governments are principally responsible for this war, according to Mearsheimer, even though he, in his March 2022 piece in The Economist, acknowledges that the Russian President Putin is responsible for the way how the war is being waged. Mearsheimer has been strongly criticized for his account, and I believe rightly so. Saying that the West bears the most responsibility implies that Putin had no other choice than to attack Ukraine. This is a very problematic statement, since Ukraine has never attacked Russia, and neither Ukraine nor NATO had any plans to do so. This account merely distracts attention from Putin's free choice to attack Ukraine and commit numerous war crimes. No wonder that the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs tweeted one of Mearsheimer's articles on Ukraine. Still, if it is the case that Putin responded to Western provocations and encirclement, even while recognizing Putin's aggressive character and free choice, one could consider a Western responsibility in the form of unwise policy that would almost certainly trigger aggression against Ukraine. But also at this level, Mearsheimer's thesis has been refuted. In recent decades, years and months, Putin and other Russian elites have stated that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, that the current Ukrainian state is an anti-Russian project, all of which can be interpreted as the denial of Ukraine's right to exist. There are very strong indications that Moscow's aggression against Ukraine has more to do with Russian ultranationalist and imperialist schemes than with NATO enlargement or any other Western policies. Such reflections can emanate from classical realism and neoclassical realism, which provide much more room for nuance than offensive structural realism. Not all great powers behave in the same predictable way. Action and reaction is always a matter of humans choosing between options and facing dilemmas. Some classical realists argue, for the same reasons as Mearsheimer pointed out, that NATO enlargement into the former Soviet Union was irresponsible. Similar arguments can be drawn from the international society tradition or the so-called English school, with authors such as Hedley Bull. For them, an international society, with its thin layer of cooperation around the minimal set of common interests and values, is the best we can hope for. Such an anarchical society implies, among other things, that great powers have a responsibility to secure international stability, and therefore need to respect each other's political and economic systems, and each other's spheres of influence to start with. NATO enlargement, crossing Russia's red lines, is not an example of good great power management. It is destabilizing. Even though national sovereignty is also a core value of a stable international society, for the greater good of international stability, smaller countries should not enjoy the full freedom to choose for whatever military alliance. Classical realism can also lead to a very different conclusion. Given the centuries-long Russian pressure on neighboring peoples and Putin's revisionism, one could argue that the problem was not that Ukraine got integrated in the West, but that this hasn't happened quickly and decisively enough. For the time being, Russia leaves Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania alone, which, unlike Ukraine, are already NATO members protected under Article 5, which provides for collective defense. It is this NATO protection against Russia that Eastern European peoples by majority have been asking for themselves, having no trust in a neutral statute. The realist tradition has equally something to say about the international reaction to the Russian invasion. With additional troops and aircraft, NATO has bolstered its eastern borders against the scenario of a Russian attack on one or more of its member states. But can the heavy economic sanctions of the West against Russia and increasing arms supplies to Ukraine be explained by realism? This is harder to assert. Ukrainian defeat would not threaten the security of most NATO countries. Perhaps realism is better at explaining Western caution, after all. There are no NATO troops in Ukraine confronting Russia, not even to secure a no-fly zone. Such interventions could lead to a direct clash between the Russian and NATO armies and escalate into an international and even nuclear war. Apparently, Ukraine is not worth this risk. Realism also explains the failure of international law and collective security. When great powers wage war over key interests, they simply blow away international institutions and norms, as exemplified by Russia, a permanent member of the UN Security Council with veto power, here acting as perpetrator. Other permanent member, China, fails to condemn Russia and join the sanctions, perhaps because it wants to keep Russia strong in the global balance of power to reduce Western dominance. Can we conclude that great powers can do what they want to smaller ones, as also illustrated by how the US and UK got away with their as illegal invasion of Iraq in 2003? Brutal interstate wars like this one also put the liberal tradition on the defensive. Where is peace? Where is cooperation based on universal values? Where is international law? Where are human rights? Still, the liberal tradition can teach several things about this war and the response to it. At the same time, this war poses several difficult questions to liberalism. An age-old liberal hypothesis is that economic interdependence fosters peace. When the economic fates of powers get intertwined, war becomes too costly for all sides. Business circles act then as lobbies for peace. Not much of this has been seen in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine, where Russia is also set to integrate raw materials and industries of the Ukrainian Donbass into the Russian economy. There are reports of Russian theft of agricultural commodities. In other words, economic interdependence can stimulate predatory behavior, not to say blatant theft. Economic interdependence between Russia and the EU, epitomized by gas pipelines, has rather led to misplaced appeasement. Instead of preventing the war, our gas and oil interdependence keeps funding the war until this day. Germany and others have now admitted their mistake. Having said this, the Russian political military establishment seems prepared to incur enormous costs and forego the revenues related to its financial economic integration with the West. In the meantime, Russia strengthens its financial economic ties with non-Western countries as alternatives. An ultranationalist authoritarian regime can consider its political military objectives more important than its economic ones. We also hope that sociological interdependence through the internet would weaken authoritarian regimes, but until now, indoctrination, censorship, and repression reduce the impact of dissident ideas in Russia, whereas it is successful in using the internet to spread fake news into the West. Democratic peace theory holds that democracies among themselves almost never wage war, and that democracies are inherently more peaceful. The latter proposition has been debunked by many examples where democracies resorted to armed interventions and invasions against non-democracies. But the democratic peace tradition also points at mechanisms that make it easier for authoritarian states to unleash brutal aggression and war. For example, Putin bolsters his domestic legitimacy through almost full control over the media that push his propaganda and keep out news and images about Russian war crimes against innocent Ukrainians and Russian casualties. However, the run-up to this war also showed how tensions increase when an authoritarian state fears the militant promotion of liberal democracy by the West. As much as the prospect of Western military assets in future NATO member Ukraine, Putin fears the attractiveness of a prosperous democracy in what was considered as an essential part of Russia's sphere of influence, on top of the Baltic states, which are already in NATO and the EU. Morally speaking, the authoritarian state is to blame for these tensions, and these tensions are no reason to condemn Eastern European peoples to the Kremlin's authoritarian shadow. Yet, these tensions are exacerbated by Putin's suspicion that Western governments, in one way or another, might also support regime change in Russia itself. Some realists and English school theorists would warn not to make a priority of such regime change. Can liberal international relations theory teach us something about the Western response to the war? The West does not intervene directly, but supports Ukraine with tough economic sanctions against Russia and substantial arms deliveries, even when the national security of NATO countries is not directly at stake. What is more, this support to Ukraine can expose Western countries to much more risk. This Western interventionism, in solidarity with Ukraine and indirectly other potential targets, notably non-NATO country Moldova, is quite puzzling. It would be simplistic and wrong to fully explain this by pressure of the military-industrial complex. There is something ideological to this interventionism. Western governments and their population are shocked by this brutal violation of international law on the European continent. They are abhorred by the violence against Ukrainian people, and within the confines of their security considerations, they are prepared to spend money on and take some risks for the Ukrainian self-defense effort. The fact that the West took different positions in other cases, by not taking sanctions against Israel over the illegal occupation of Palestine since 1967, by Western countries illegally invading Iraq in 2003, is evidence of blatant hypocrisy, but no proof for the absence of principled and humanitarian considerations in the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What we can conclude is that liberal idealistic considerations often play a role to differing degrees, according to context and alongside other strategic, economic or ideological interests. Critics point out that the more militant this ideological drive becomes, the more tensions it can generate. As we speak beginning of May, political voices in the US and UK put the Putin regime fundamentally into question, dismiss any dialogue with it, and call for kicking Russia completely out of Ukraine, including from the territories it controls since 2014. In contrast, the Ukrainian government itself seems to be more prepared to compromise. This echoes the muscled neoconservatism that we saw during the Bush Jr. administration, whereas realists and many progressists call for caution. The social constructivist tradition shows how ideas shape political reality. Overlapping with the liberal tradition is the question we've just touched upon: to what extent international norms really play a role in the response to Russia's invasion. Ideas or mental constructions are relevant at many levels in this story. Whereas realists assume objective security interests, constructivists argue that in our complex world, the definition of security largely comes down to subjective ideas. Why on earth was the collapse of the Soviet Union a catastrophe? Why on earth would Ukraine be vital to Russia's security? As a buffer? Against whom or what? Ukraine wanted to become a member of NATO for defensive reasons, while neither Ukraine nor NATO had any plans to attack Russia. In the same vein, successive US administrations from the 1950s to 70s deemed South Vietnam vital to US security. They fought a horrific war for almost 20 years to keep South Vietnam out of the hands of the communists, and lost. By the time the Americans left Vietnam, after almost 3 million victims, the new consensus in Washington was that Vietnam has never been a vital security interest. These are mental constructions. It would also be very interesting to consider this war through the lens of Alexander Wen's theory as laid out in his 1999 book, Social Theory of International Politics. Through their accumulation of interactions, actors shape an international structure, which in its turn not only informs actors' behavior, but also the definition of their interests and their identities. A hypothesis derived from this theory could be that the post-Cold War mindset of the Kremlin has been shaped through interaction with a West that was overly triumphant at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and later years. Whereas the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and many others advocated a new pan-European security architecture, for example by replacing both NATO and Warsaw Pact by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or by admitting Russia to NATO, the West chose to enlarge NATO while leaving Russia out. In many respects, Russia was no longer considered as a great power and no longer as an equal. The ensuing Russian frustrations formed breeding ground for ultra-nationalist currents that rose to power in later years, and also politically socialized Vladimir Putin. For them, the Cold War has never stopped. In the meantime, Putin and his entourage have radicalized to such a point that it is too late. A parallel can be drawn between the way the Allied powers punished and isolated Germany in the first years after the First World War, and how this episode helped Hitler and his Nazi party to come to power. At a much later stage, relations can deteriorate to such a point that diplomatic overtures and unilateral confidence-building steps no longer work to soften the other side. This should have been prevented way before Although an aggressive leader remains fully responsible for his aggressive actions of choice, here we can establish another kind of responsibility, historical responsibility, with those actors that let deteriorate an important relationship or international structure through unwise policies. Think of a society that does not provide enough care to a youngster who is on his way to become a dangerous criminal. Foreign policy analysis looks for explanations or additional explanations at the domestic level of states, and more precisely into the machinery where foreign policy is made. When power is highly concentrated in the hands of a small elite, the mindset and personality of the leader and his closest aides becomes very important. A relevant question would be if any other Russian leader, given Russia's so-called objective security interests, would have taken the same decisions as Putin. This seems unlikely, as in the current war, Putin comes out as ruthless and reckless and ready to incur enormous losses and risks to Russia and to his own regime in ways different from Soviet leaderships. It looks that Putin, who has become older and radicalized, wants to achieve his master plan in his lifetime. Here we have a lot of indications that the personality of the leader matters, and matters a lot. Finally, the post-colonial tradition also provides a few useful insights during this war. This tradition invites us to decolonize our minds and be aware at all levels and in all dimensions of social life of the historically rooted and ongoing structural inequalities between the North and the South. We already touched upon Western hypocrisy. Solidarity with Ukraine and its refugees is great, but why was there no such solidarity with the Palestinians, Iraqis, Afghans, Syrians? Why was there less outrage over the Russian bombardments in Syria? The answer is that the West is not so enlightened and embracing cosmopolitan values and the equality of all human beings as is often pretended. There is also mental decolonization to do at another level. Some realists, some on the right and some on the left, maintain that the West is largely to blame for this war because of the alleged humiliation of Russia in recent decades, NATO expansion and so on. Even though this is set from a highly self-critical perspective, it is again putting the West central to everything important. Critics have referred to this phenomenon as West-planing, explaining everything from an exclusive Western perspective. Here, two realities are downplayed or even ignored. First, the responsibility of Russian imperialism. Second, the fact that people in Central and Eastern Europe themselves sought protection with NATO against the real threat of Russian imperialist aggression. Maybe a good conclusion is that every account and evaluation of this war should start from the realization of the suffering of the Ukrainian people who are victims of unprovoked aggression.